Good afternoon, everybody. So as you know, last week was a very exciting week for the space exploration. It was really exploration, as I will show you. As the lander Philae landed successfully on the surface of the comet. It was not like a straight line. The Rosetta mission overall actually was not a straight line. It was a mission with full of twists. So the first twist actually was encountered during the development of the mission after the successful flyby of Halley by the spacecraft Giotto. The next step in the exploration of the comet was to return a sample from a comet. And thanks to that, there was a joint mission, NASA and ESA mission, called CNSR, corresponding to the Comet Nucleus Sample Return. But after a while, NASA decided to withdraw, and ESA decided to continue alone the development of this mission by changing a little bit the main objective, which was not anymore to return sample, but to perform in situ analysis of the surface of a comet. So there was a call of opportunity of a small lander. Three organisms replied to this call: JPL, CNES, and Max Planck Institute. JPL and CNES worked together to propose one lander, Champollion, and the German colleagues proposed the Roland lander. As usual, the US part withdrew, and then CNES and the German colleagues worked together to provide the Philae lander, what you well know now. So you see, it was not like a straight line just for the development of the mission. Then the second twist, I will say, is the shape of the comet. You see here a movie, one of the first images occurred by the OSIRIS imager, which is a German instrument on board Rosetta. It was not easy to land on that. Actually, there was two dedicated meetings to select the landing site of Philae. I will show you a movie. Actually, just here. Okay. The two last final landing sites were site C and site G, and after finally the site G was lead site as the first target. Okay, you can see that. So actually, the most, I would say, the main criteria for the selection of this site was the safety of the spacecraft, safety of Philae. Here you can see again another images obtained by OSIRIS, which show actually that the surface is very rough with several cliffs. So it's in terms of safety, it's not easy. Also, there is a very nice image by OSIRIS again, which shows some activity. Again, it could have complicated a little bit the landing of Philae. And then finally, on November 12th, so last week, last Wednesday, ESA decided to perform the different phases, the separation, descent, and landing phases. So Shiva, actually, I am a member of the Shiva, the PI is Jean-Pierre Vivring. We have 7 cameras around the lander Philae, and we were able to perform a farewell image. What you can see, actually, we got like 10 images, but this is the best image what we got. You can clearly see actually the body of the spacecraft on the solar panel of the spacecraft. So this image has been obtained just 40 seconds after the separation. So everything seems to be nominal. Again, OSIRIS was able also to perform some images, as you will see in the next slide. Here, this is the first view of OSIRIS of the Philae. I don't know exactly where. Okay, here you have the time actually of the acquisition. And actually, OSIRIS was able to perform different images and to follow the descent of Philae on the comet. And the next image is a little bit scary. You can see here, this is one of the images just 16 minutes before the touchdown. And you can see Philae here on the huge body, which is pretty huge in comparison to the Philae, which is about one meter of size. So you can see one of the images, this is the first image where we see both the comet and Philae. And then OSIRIS was able to locate the different location of Philae just before the touchdown, which occurred here. So you can see actually there is some rotation. If you look carefully, the gears of Philae is not always the same, so it means that there is a rotation. And you can see here the touchdown. And you know that now there is a rebound, but you can clearly see here the 3 spots corresponding to the 3 gears of Philae. This is a Rollis image. This is an imager which is below Philae, and which he took this image just 40 seconds on of the surface of the comet. You can see here the gear of Philae, and we were lucky not to land on this boulder, for instance, because clearly the mission would have been over. Here, this is a simulation. The touchdown occurred at 4:35 Paris time. This is a simulation of the Shiva observation, though we expected to land in such a nice, with a nice landscape. But this is we got a panorama 5 minutes and 50 seconds after the landing, after the touchdown. And this is the image what we got. So actually, it was we were really disappointed, and we did not understand exactly what was going on, especially because everybody was congratulating in the ISA TV on the CNES TV. So we were, I was at IS, I got this image with my colleagues, and we were a little bit skeptical about the success of the landing. Anyway, as you know, everything worked fine. Here, this is an image taken again by OnComet, I would say, okay, OnComet. This is the last image occurred by Osiris, so like 8 minutes after the landing, which occurred here. So we were lucky actually to get this image, because thanks to that, it will be easier to locate actually the final landing of Philae. But you can see here the nice, this beautiful image where you can see the last image taken by Osiris of Philae. Then this is the different sequences actually, just before and after actually after the first touchdown. As you know, there are another one touchdown. Oh, okay, no, sorry. Here this is another view of the different location of Philae, but with a larger view of the comet. And the next one is even more impressive actually. You can see here the different location. And then the spacecraft of the lander Philae goes into this direction. So as you know, we finally landed on the surface of the comet. Here, this is the first image that we got with Philae, with Shiva. You can clearly see here actually the gear of Philae. And you can distinguish, maybe you cannot very well distinguish here, but we see some structure. And if we stretch a little bit the contrast, we can clearly see actually this nice block. I don't know exactly what is the composition of the block, but thanks to the other images what we got here, actually this is acquired by the camera 3 and 4. We are able to merge the two cameras, and we see that we landed very close to a cliff. So it seems that we are we are very close, yes, to a cliff, and actually we are surrounded by cliff. Here, this is different images taken by Shiva. So we have here we see a cliff. We see a cliff here, and actually here we are so close to the cliff that it seems that we don't know exactly what is the texture, what is the structure of the cliff here in this place here. So, but actually, we were very lucky to acquire such an image, because I just want to remind you that actually the landing site has only 1.5 hours per rotation of illumination. And we decided to acquire another panorama, Unfortunately, the panorama was taken during the dark night. So we did not get interesting data, obviously. I will not show you the image. So the only image what we acquire right now with Shiva are this one, okay? But we are actually, for us, it's much better to land close to a leaf, because we can clearly see actually the structure of the comet itself. So we are starting the analysis. It will going to be take time, but for us, it's much better to land on such difficult landing site. But at least we have an access to the structure itself of the comet. So you will know more about the analysis in the coming weeks. So actually, there are 10 instruments on board Philae. On here, just underline all the different instruments which perform almost nominally measurements. I don't have news from APXS and Ptolemy. Maybe somebody here are involved in the Rosetta in these two instruments, but it seems that all the other instruments at least got very nice data. So we are working on that. And there is in 2 weeks there is the first science working team for Philae at Darmstadt. So it's going to be a very interesting, very exciting time for us. and for the space exploration overall. Okay, so I just finished here my first part of my presentation. I don't know if you have question on this first part, and then or maybe we can, I don't know, what do you want? I can put
have the questions
after? Okay, okay. So let's go back to oh no, okay, no, just the last slide on Philae. So over twist, as you see, it was not a straight line. The over twists are expected. First, it's going to be pretty tough to find and to image Philae thanks to the Osiris imager. I hope we will find eventually the landing site. There is a secondary battery on Philae. It has been to be recharged in order to wake up the lander. The team which operates Philae seems to be very confident on the fact that we will be able to wake up Philae by next spring. So if it's possible, it's going to be very, very exciting. And then, we will, thanks to this wake up, we will be able to acquire some new data. Especially because Philae, actually, just before the end of the operation, using the primary battery, the Philae was able to rotate by 25 degrees. So if we take a new image, we will not see the same thing. So it's why we are waiting for this new data. Okay, so now let's go back to Mars. Actually, so Philippe asked me to provide not an overview, but to discuss a little bit what could be the constraint on the thermal evolution of Mars as viewed from remote sensing observation. So the main aspect of my talk is to provide some new constraints on the thermal evolution of Mars provided by the observation in the visible, the near-infrared wavelength range, which have been observation, which have been acquired by some imaging spectrometer. So the thermal evolution, we cannot directly observe, obviously, the thermal evolution, but the thermal evolution is obviously coupled to the volcanic and the magmatic history. And to constrain the volcanic and magmatic history, we can better understand the property, constrain the properties of the Martian surface in terms of composition, geological context, and then try to retrace, actually, this volcanic and magmatic history. And then to go back to see the consequences on the thermal evolution of the planet. So here I will mostly focus on the composition of the Martian surface. Different possibilities can be used for possibility can be used for constraining the composition of planetary surface, especially the Martian surface. You can use the in situ chemical analysis of the Martian crust, crustal rocks, which have been performed by Spirit, Opportunity, on the MSL, Curiosity. We can also use the petrology of the Martian meteorite, and we can also compare this data to some terrestrial analogs. Here I will show you actually some new results on the surface composition from remote sensing observation. Two mineralogical diagnostics can be, I will discuss two mineralogical diagnostics, the model composition of the mafic-rich region and the olivine distribution. So let's go back to the model composition of the mafic-rich region. Actually, so I will show you this mineralogical diagnostic have been acquired by the Omega and CRISM observation. The Omega and CRISM are two visible and imaging spectrometers on board Mars Express and Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. And they perform visible and infrared observation. And in this wavelength range, we can identify different types of pyroxene. For instance, we can distinguish between high calcium pyroxene and low calcium pyroxene. We can also easily identify olivine and anorthosite, for instance. Here you can see a map of Mars with the spatial distribution of the pyroxene-bearing region. You can see that we did not identify pyroxene everywhere on the surface of Mars, but most of the detections are performed in the low albedo regions, which correspond to the typical volcanic provinces of Mars. But the important aspect here to really constrain the thermal history of Mars, and to better understand the surface properties, we need to acquire and to derive quantitative information. And to get this quantitative information, we need to perform some spectral modeling in order to derive the modal mineralogy. So I will show you now some results on the modal mineralogy of different regions of Mars, from the early Noachian, so the oldest terrains on Mars, up to Amazonian, the youngest one. So here you can see actually mineral classification in the ternary diagram of plagioclase, pyroxene, and olivine. All the terrains which have been analyzed have a modal mineralogy which are clustered here. So it means that this cluster means that actually the surface of Mars has a pretty homogeneous composition, at least in the near-infrared wavelength range. This composition corresponds to an abundance of plagioclase always larger than the pyroxene. And for the spectral modeling, we don't need really too much olivine. Actually, the abundance of olivine is always less than 10%. So it seems that this composition is well consistent with evolved basalt rather than ultramafic basalts. Here, this is the same classification, but by adding some olivine-bearing terrains, which are represented by the red diamonds. And you can see that because most of the terrains don't require the presence of olivine, but in some cases, you need olivine, and these terrains are localized, and they are dominated, the modal mineralogy is dominated by plagioclase and olivine minerals, and the overall composition is typical of the olivine-bearing basalt. I also here plot the composition of some Gusev basalt, which have been analyzed by Spirit, the rover Spirit, and you can see that the typical olivine-bearing terrains observed on Mars from remote sensing observation are very close to what it has been obtained thanks to the Spirit observation, so in situ observation. Here, this is here we can compare actually the modal mineralogy of the different terrains which are here with the modal mineralogy of some Martian meteorite. Two types of Martian meteorite are shown here: basaltic shergotite in blue and picritic shergotite here. So if we compare the modal mineralogy, we can deduce that the composition of the Martian terrains are more consistent with basaltic shergotite than the picritic shergotite, which are located here, which are clearly a plagioclase poorer. Here, this is another view to see the modal mineralogy of these different terrains. This time, I plot in the high calcium pyroxene, low calcium pyroxene, and olivine ternary diagram. And we see an interesting trend in the evolution of the ratio low calcium pyroxene over high calcium pyroxene. We see actually a decrease of this ratio from the Noachian aged outcrop, which are the oldest terrain that we are able to observe on Mars, to the Ammonian age lava flows, which are here, corresponding to the blue triangles. So how we can interpret this observation, actually, the best way to explain this decrease of ratio is a decreasing of a degree of partial melting with time. And actually, this is consistent with the study of Baratou, who use actually the GRS data to calculate actually the partial degree of partial melting to explain some GRS observation, and it's very consistent with the two studies are very consistent. So it's going to be an important and robust observation. So in conclusion, on this part, the mafic-rich provinces on Mars are evolved basalt, with plagioclase, high calcium pyroxene, low calcium pyroxene as the dominant phases, which could indicate a dry volcanism and clearly a decreasing of degree of partial melting with time. Most of the mafic-rich provinces of Mars have a very low abundance of olivine, less than 10%, which could indicate a lack of primitive magma, but I will show you that in the next slide. Actually, olivine is still found in localized and well-defined setting of early Hesperian age. I will discuss that in the next slide. We did not identify pyroxene cumulate, and as you can see, the composition is pretty homogeneous, which could mean that the convection on Mars was strong enough to manage possible sweeping of a possible ocean magma down into its mantle and reduce to this way the heterogeneity of the Martian surface composition. Also, I show you the comparison with the meteorite. It seems that the early Noachian outcrops have intermediate composition between the basaltic shergotite and the more evolved basaltic of late Noachian and Hesperian ages. So how we can interpret that? The evolution through the Noachian Martian crust could be the result of first partial melt of ultramafic rocks, following by a basaltic magma differentiation, which forms the basaltic shergotite on the evolved basalt of the Martian surface. So this is just an interpretation to be discussed, but it seems that at least the analysis what we perform could indicate such evolution, which question actually the age of the basaltic shergotite, by the way, because if we explain if this interpretation is right, it means that the basaltic shergotite are not anymore young. It's favored actually old age for the basaltic shergotite. So now let's go to the, I would say, third part of my talk, which corresponds to the olivine distribution. So I explain you that most of the terrains does not require the presence of olivine, but here you can see actually the olivine spatial distribution as mapped by Omega and CRISM. And you can see all the blue spot on the red, green and red spot correspond to the detection of olivine on the surface of Mars. Different settings were identified. Here I will just talk about this first setting, which corresponds of olivine detected in smooth, flat, and rich plains, and also in crater floors in the southern islands. Okay, as you can see, it mostly corresponds to the blue points here. This is a typical example of this olivine setting, which is found in flat and rich plains on crater floor, and you can compare actually the olivine map distribution in this region to a typical image of Themis, and you can see clearly that the olivine is found in these very flat plains, and also this olivine terrains, olivine material filled this crater floor. Here we have a 3D view of these plains, and we detect some ridges, which is typical of lava. So it seems that this olivine-rich material corresponds to olivine-rich lavas, which have been deposited through fissural volcanism. This is the best interpretation, actually. Here, I just focus on this small part of this image, where you can see actually the transition between the olivine-enriched lavas to the olivine pore. I will go back to this issue, actually, because it seems that on the Noachian terrain, which corresponds to oldest terrains on Mars, you can see here that it's much more cratered than here, for instance. So on the number of craters indicates more or less the age of the surface. So what you can see here, actually, is that the Noachian terrains are in some ways depleted in olivine. I will go back to this issue later. Here, this is a spatial distribution of all this olivine found in the flat and rich plains on crater floor. You can see that we found many locations in the southern hemisphere, and we were able to estimate actually the age of the formation of these different settings. And all these olivine terrains were formed at 3.7 billion years, so it corresponds to the early Hesperian. This plot shows you actually the volcanic activity as a function of the time, but derived from surface structures. It's not derived from composition. And what we observe here, actually, this is like a pronounced peak of volcanic activity during the early Hesperian, which start here, okay, with the presence of flowed basalt-like plains volcanism. Actually, this volcanism has been already and previously detected by two previous studies, Tanaka et al. And Ed et al. And the most prominent unit and place during this phase, during this activity, volcanic activity, is Hesperian-rich plains occurring within and outside crater through the lowland plains region of both hemispheres. I show you a typical example previously. And these deposits were interpreted to be extensive lava flows erupted with low viscosity from many sources. So it seems that all the detection what I show you correspond to olivine-enriched lava unplaced by fissural volcanism. So we consider that the olivine could be a witness of the volcanic activity as a function of the time. First, I recall you that the olivine is found in the extended deposit in Low Albedo Island of early Hesperian age, and we explain this, the formation of this deposit as a result of early Hesperian planet-wide fissure volcanism. I just want to go back on this observation where we did not detect olivine in the Noachian island. So how we can explain this depletion and this contrast between the olivine-enriched early Hesperian lava and the olivine-poor terrains formed during the Noachian? There are two possibilities. Either the primary lithology of the Noachian terrains is deficient in olivine, or olivine could have been depleted through later modification processes. We cannot exclude actually the second point, okay? But if we consider the first explanation is a good one, we can then retrace onto the thermal evolution of the planet in order to explain the enrichment of olivine in the Hesperian lavas in comparison to the depletion of olivine in the Noachian lava. So this enrichment could be the result of the evolution of the temperature of the mantle as following. First, we had a cooling during the Noachian, which could have precluded any crystallization of the olivine. And during the early Hesperian, an increase of the temperature could have occurred due to some radioactive elements, for instance, heating. And this could have initiated partial fusion of the mantle and ascension of the magma through fissure formed by the impact, especially impact formed by the late heavy bombardment. Okay? And this is that's all. Yes, thank you for your attention.